Well, for the second year in a row, Alaska's world-famous snow crab season has been canceled. Billions of snow crabs have disappeared since 2018, and now scientists say they know why.
Inside a Soviet cargo plane in the 1960s, millions of king crabs struggled to breathe in cramped tanks. Moscow wasn't trying to invade Alaska. They were trying to steal its wealth. They flew these Alaskan natives across the world to seed a new empire in Europe. It worked so well that it's now a billion-dollar industry. But back in Alaska, 10 billion crabs just vanished. The invaders won, while the natives disappeared. Let's look at this shocking turn of events. Kremlin's living cargo. In 1961, a series of secret flights took off from the Soviet Far East that had nothing to do with the space race or nuclear posturing. Inside those planes sat thousands of red king crabs, packed into aerated tanks, destined for a journey across 11 time zones. The result was the birth of what would eventually be called Stalin's crab, even though the man himself was already gone. It was a biological heist designed to solve a very specific problem for the Kremlin. Moscow had a luxury shortage, and they were tired of watching the Americans and Alaskans get all the glory in the global seafood market. Here is the thing about the Soviet Union under Khrushchev. They were obsessed with improving nature. They looked at the Barents Sea, that icy stretch of water north of Norway and Russia, and saw it as an empty field waiting to be farmed. It didn't matter that king crabs had never lived there in the history of the planet. To the Soviet Central Planning Committee, the ocean was just another collective farm, only wetter. They wanted a high-value export they could sell to the West for hard currency, effectively bypassing trade sanctions by selling a delicacy that the world simply couldn't resist. Now, think about the logistics for a second, because this part is actually wild. You couldn't just throw a bunch of crabs in a box and hope for the best. Soviet scientists at the Murmansk Marine Biological Institute spent years debating how to pull this off. Between 1961 and 1969, they executed a massive transport operation. They took roughly 10,000 adult crabs and over 1.5 million larvae from the Pacific waters near Vladivostok and flew them over the frozen heart of Russia to the Kola Fjord near Murmansk. This wasn't just a handful of specimens, it was an intentional, industrial-scale seeding of a new ecosystem. I want you to visualize the map for a moment. On one side, you have the native Pacific Range stretching from the Kamchatka Peninsula over to the Bering Sea and Alaska. On the complete opposite side of the Eurasian landmass, you have the Barents Sea. These two worlds were never meant to meet, but the Soviets were so confident in their nature tweaking that they didn't just drop the crabs and walk away, they watched them. And what they found in the early data was genuinely shocking. In their native Pacific waters, a female king crab might only successfully produce 4 or 5 recruits, basically offspring that survive to adulthood due to predators and competition. But in the Barents Sea, these crabs had no natural enemies. There were no octopuses or specific bottom feeders that evolved to crack their shells. The data showed that for every female, nearly 30 recruits were surviving. That is a 30-fold explosion in population compared to the Alaskan stocks. The Soviet experiment wasn't just working. It was overperforming to a terrifying degree. By 1981, the New York Times was already reporting on the success of this experiment. There was this intense sense of Soviet pride. They'd successfully engineered a billion-dollar fishery out of thin air. They'd taken the very best of Alaska's biology and transplanted it into their own backyard, effectively creating a biological Red Army that was already starting to march across the seafloor. It was the ultimate Cold War flex, taking a Western icon and making it thrive under a hammer and sickle. But here is where it gets interesting, and a bit uncomfortable. When you treat the ocean like a farm, you assume the livestock stays within the fence. But the ocean has no fences. The Soviet scientists were so focused on the export value and the hard currency that they entirely ignored the biological borders of their neighbors. They were playing a high-stakes game of ecological poker with the entire North Atlantic as the pot. And for a while, it looked like they were winning. The crabs were massive, the meat was sweet, and the Moscow elite finally had their world-class delicacy. Now, I have to ask you something. If you were a scientist back then, and you knew that introducing a new species could create a billion-dollar industry, but might also wipe out every native sea urchin and kelp forest in its path, would you have green-lit those flights? Would you risk the entire ecosystem just to ensure the state had a luxury export to sell? Because that is exactly what happened. The Kremlin got its dinner and it got its cash, but it also released a force that no one could actually control. The success of those 1961 flights created a massive, hungry army that started to do what armies do. They expanded. They didn't just stay in the Russian waters where they were dropped. These crabs began a slow, steady crawl westward, moving along the floor of the Arctic shelf at a pace that caught everyone off guard. They were looking for more food, more space, and new territory to claim. The experiment was over, and the invasion had begun. Those crabs took root in the mud and the dark of the Barents Sea. And then they did something the Soviets hadn't officially planned for. Red Monster marches west. By the mid-1970s, the Soviet scientists realized they had created something they couldn't actually contain. Those millions of larvae they released didn't just sit patiently in the Russian bays where they were dropped. Ocean currents took over, acting like a massive, invisible conveyor belt that carried these tiny, swimming invaders hundreds of kilometers to the west. And that is how the red king crab officially crossed the border into Norway. It wasn't a sudden invasion with a single headline. It was a slow, relentless crawl along the seabed that eventually turned the Norwegian fjords into a literal battlefield. By the time the 1990s rolled around, the situation in northern Norway, specifically in places like Finnmark, went from an interesting biological curiosity to a full-blown ecological crisis. Imagine looking at a vibrant, healthy fjord. You'd expect to see lush kelp forests swaying in the current, teeming with sea urchins, small fish, and diverse life. Now, look at what happened after the crabs arrived. They moved through those kelp forests like a fleet of underwater chainsaws. They ate everything. They devoured over 80% of the sea urchins in some areas. They picked the rocks clean of mollusks and worms, and eventually, the local cod population started to feel the heat. In some spots, cod egg survival dropped by 50% because the crabs were essentially vacuuming up the future of the Norwegian fishing industry before it even had a chance to hatch. It was an absolute massacre. And for a long time, the Norwegian government didn't quite know how to react. On one hand, you had the environmentalists who were watching a pristine Arctic ecosystem get systematically dismantled by a Soviet experiment. They wanted these things gone, entirely. But on the other hand, you had the local fishermen who were pulling up their nets only to find them shredded by massive, spiky legs. At first, they hated them. They called them Stalin's crabs with a spit of disgust. But then they looked at the market price. Here's where it gets really interesting. These crabs weren't just big, they were delicious, and the global market for king crab was absolutely starving for supply. Suddenly, the very creature that was destroying the local ecosystem became the most valuable thing in the water. Norway eventually had to make a choice. Do we try to kill them all, or do we start a business? They ended up doing both. They drew a line on the map. East of that line, near the Russian border, they managed the crabs as a high-value fishery with strict quotas. West of that line, it was a free-for-all zone where the goal was to kill as many as possible to stop the spread. But those crabs didn't care about Norwegian lines on a map. According to reports from the Institute of Marine Research as recently as 2023, these things are still expanding further west and south. They've become a biological red army that pays the bills. Today, the Norwegian king crab industry is worth over $200 million a year to their local economy. It's a massive cash cow, especially now with the war in Ukraine. See, when the West slapped sanctions on Russian seafood, it essentially handed the entire European and American market to Norway on a silver platter. Every time you see a Barents Sea king crab on a high-end menu today, you're looking at the direct descendant of a Soviet plane ride from 60 years ago. It's created this bizarre tug-of-war. If you go to a town like Kirkenes, you'll find people who owe their entire livelihoods to this invader. They've built processing plants, they've bought new boats, and they've sent their kids to college on crab money. But if you talk to the marine biologists, they'll show you underwater deserts where there used to be life. It's an undeniable truth of the modern world. Economics almost always trumps ecology when the claws are paying the bills. We talk a big game about protecting native species, but when an invader brings in $1 billion, we suddenly start calling it a resource instead of a pest. If you were a fisherman in a struggling coastal town and an invasive species showed up that destroyed the local kelp but made you a millionaire overnight, would you actually support a plan to cull them? Or would you be the first one out there protecting your new gold mine? It's a question that Norway is still wrestling with today, especially as they now cull over 1 million crabs a year just to keep the population from swallowing the entire coastline. And while all of this was happening, while Russia and Norway were arguing over quotas and fighting off poachers in an ocean that was suddenly overflowing with crab meat, something very different was happening on the other side of the world. Because while the fake population in the Barents Sea was booming, the original native population in Alaska was about to face a nightmare that no one saw coming. The contrast is almost hard to believe. In the Barents Sea, there are so many crabs that they have to kill them just to slow them down. But if you look at the Bering Sea today, the pots are coming up empty. The industry is dying, and the billion-dollar empire the Soviets stole from Alaska is now the only thing keeping the global market alive. Think about that for a second, because right now, Norway is battling a surplus that won't stop growing, while just across the pole, Alaska is hunting for ghosts. 10 billion body mystery. In 2021, the NOAA research vessel Oscar Dyson headed out into the Bering Sea for its annual trawl survey, just like it had for decades. The scientists on board expected the usual data points, a few fluctuations here and there, maybe some movement in the schools. But as they pulled up the nets and crunched the numbers, a terrifying silence settled over the deck. 10 billion snow crabs were just gone. It wasn't a small dip or a bad season. It was a total wipeout. 10 billion animals had vanished from the face of the earth in just 3 years, and the red king crab stocks weren't far behind, crashing by nearly 90%. Here is the thing about a collapse this big. Billions of creatures don't just vanish quietly without a trace. It was a forensic mystery that left the entire fishing industry in a state of absolute shock. For generations, the Bering Sea was seen as this inexhaustible engine of protein, a place so cold and so productive that it felt untouchable. But when the 2022 season was officially canceled, reality hit like a freight train. We're talking about a $400 million fishery that simply ceased to exist overnight. Boats that cost millions were suddenly worth nothing more than scrap metal, and families who had fished these waters since the territory became a state were filing for bankruptcy. Now, here is where it gets interesting, and honestly, a little bit scary. Scientists spent months trying to figure out if the crabs had just moved. They looked further north toward the Siberian coast, thinking maybe they'd chased the cold water. But they weren't there. They hadn't migrated. They had starved. Between 2018 and 2019, a massive marine heat wave nicknamed the Blob settled over the Bering Sea. Now, you might think a few degrees wouldn't matter to a crab at the bottom of the ocean. But for a cold-blooded crustacean, temperature is everything. A study published in the journal Science in 2023 found that when the water warmed up, it triggered a biological death spiral. The crab's metabolism didn't just tick up, it spiked. It literally tripled. Think about that for a second. Imagine if your body suddenly required 3 times the amount of food just to stay alive, but you were stuck in a room where the fridge was empty. That's exactly what happened on the seafloor. The crabs were burning through their energy reserves at an impossible rate, and the ecosystem couldn't keep up. There wasn't enough food to fuel that heat-induced hunger. 10 billion crabs essentially sat on the mud and starved to death because they couldn't eat fast enough to stay ahead of their own rising body temperatures. But wait, it gets weirder. As the scientists dug deeper into the history of the Bering Sea, they realized that climate change might have pulled the trigger, but we, humans, had already loaded the gun decades ago. And this is where the Soviet legacy comes back to haunt us, in a way most people completely overlook. Back in the 1960s, long before the Barents Sea experiment was a global headline, the Soviet Union sent massive industrial fleets into the Bering Sea. They weren't just fishing, they were mining the ocean. In 1964 alone, Soviet factory ships pulled over 235,000 cases of king crab out of these waters. They used massive trawls that scraped the seafloor, destroying the very structures and nurseries that young crabs needed to survive. The Americans eventually pushed back, leading to the 200-mile fishing limits we have today. But the damage was already done. We spent half a century over-harvesting the biggest, strongest males, thinning out the genetic pool, and leaving the population incredibly vulnerable. So, when the blob arrived, it didn't hit a healthy, resilient population. It hit a stock that had been leaned on for decades by both Soviet and American greed. It was a house of cards, and the heat wave was just the final gust of wind. It's an uncomfortable truth to swallow, but these billions didn't just vanish because of a natural shift. They vanished because we ignored every single warning sign until the pots were literally empty. This is the debate currently tearing apart fishing towns from Kodiak to Dutch Harbor. If you look at the data, who do you think is the real villain here? Is it the invisible hand of climate change? Or is it the decades of aggressive overfishing and Soviet-era nature mining that primed the sea for a crash? The tragedy in Alaska has left everyone desperate. You have boat owners who have lost everything, and scientists who are scrambling to find a way to reset the ocean. And when humans get desperate, they start looking for radical solutions. They start looking for a way to play God with the ecosystem again. Which brings us to a very strange, very circular moment in history. To save the native crabs, Alaska is now considering something that sounds eerily familiar. They are looking at massive hatchery programs, essentially breeding millions of crabs in tanks to dump them back into the wild. It is an attempt to reseed the ocean, almost exactly like those Soviet scientists did in the Barents Sea 60 years ago. But there's a massive risk involved. When the Soviets did it, they created a billion-dollar monster that they couldn't control. If Alaska tries to do the same to save its native stocks, are we just repeating the same cycle of hubris? Are we just trying to farm a sea that has already told us it's had enough? The empty seas are forcing us into these desperate fixes, and it feels like we're about to double down on the same logic that got us here in the first place. Because, as we've seen in the Barents Sea, when you start moving biology around to suit your bank account, you might get the profit you wanted, but you also get a biological red army that doesn't care about your plans. And as the Alaskan crews look out over a Bering Sea that used to be a gold mine, they aren't just seeing a lack of crabs, they are seeing the end of an era. The success of the fake population in Europe is now the only thing keeping the world supplied with king crab, while the original home of the species has become a graveyard of 10 billion ghosts. Alaskan hatchery gamble. When the Bering Sea officially shut down, the silence in the Alaskan fishing ports was deafening. But behind closed doors, a new, frantic conversation started. If the crabs weren't coming back on their own, we had to go get them. This is where the story comes full circle. Alaska is now looking at a program called AK-CRRAB. It sounds professional, But if you look past the acronym, it's a gamble that echoes the 1960s Kremlin playbook. We are talking about building massive hatcheries to pump millions of larvae back into the wild to fix an ocean that we broke. Here is the thing about desperation. When a billion-dollar industry vanishes, people stop asking, "Should we do this?" and start asking, "How fast can we start?" The Alaska Department of Fish and Game has been careful, calling it careful augmentation. But let's be real. This is an attempt to play God with the Bering Sea. They've already started trials, raising millions of larvae in tanks, dreaming of the day they can dump them into the ocean to jumpstart the economy. Think about that for a second. We just spent the last 20 minutes talking about how the Soviet experiment in the Barents Sea created a biological red army that devoured ecosystems. That was born from the same mindset, the belief that nature is just a factory and we are the managers. The irony is so thick you could cut it with a crab saw. We are literally using the Soviet playbook to try to survive a climate disaster that was partially caused by the industrial hubris of the Cold War. But the science is messy. If you release millions of hatchery-born crabs, you aren't just adding numbers. You're messing with the soul of the species. Geneticists are sounding the alarm about genetic dilution. Crabs born in a tank don't have the same survival pressures as wild ones. If they breed, they could weaken the entire Alaskan stock, making them even less resilient to the next heat wave. And with NOAA calling the Bering Sea's warming a permanent shift, we might be pouring millions of babies into a graveyard where the temperature simply won't let them live. There's also the risk of a Barents 2.0 scenario. If we move stocks to save them, who's to say they won't become an invasive nightmare for someone else? We've seen this movie before. When you move biology around to protect your bank account, nature usually finds a way to make you regret it. Since the war in Ukraine started, the US has banned Russian crab. That should have been a win for Alaska, but since there are no Alaskan crabs to sell, prices have skyrocketed. The only people cashing in are the Norwegians, fishing for the descendants of those original Soviet invaders. It is a total supply chain flip. So, I have to ask you, are hatcheries a savior, or are we just building another Barents Sea disaster on our own doorstep? Desperation breeds repeats of past mistakes. We saw it in 1961 with the Soviet flights, and we're seeing it now in the Alaskan labs. We're doubling down on the same hubris. As the first millions are prepped for release, the ghost of that Soviet cargo plane is hovering over every tank. We're about to find out if we've learned anything at all. 60 years ago, the Soviets treated the ocean like a laboratory. They wanted a billion-dollar empire, and they got it. But at a cost we're only just beginning to calculate. Now, Alaska is staring into the same abyss, weighing the same gamble. Are we repeating history or fixing it? If you were holding the hatch, would you let them go? Thanks for watching.